good morning and a very warm welcome to this brief overview of Indian writings in English. But since this is a part of a lecture series connected to Indian culture, I would first like to establish the connection between culture and literature. I would like to begin with a quote by T.S. Eliot in his notes towards a definition of culture. He defines culture as that which makes life worth living. And if culture includes everything that is connected to the human value system, customs, tradition, way of life, then literature is inevitably a part of culture. And so one can assume a close relationship between literature and culture. And at the end of this slide, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that in the literature of a nation lies the essence of culture, history, religious belief, and an entire value system. What then is literature in a multi-linguistic country like India? South Asia or the Indian subcontinent includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that was East Pakistan until 1971, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and the two important facts related to this part of the world are that it is culturally diverse as well as linguistically diverse. Three waves of conquest brought lasting influences to Indian literature. Number one, the Aryan invasions, they brought the language. And essentially the parent language to all Indian languages is Sanskrit. We cannot rule out the Islamic conquests that took place 8th century onwards, added Persian and Arabic elements, and finally we had the growth of Urdu as a language. And now we come to the most important influence, which is that of the British rule. It began with trade in the 17th century and it lasted till the end of the Raj, that is the colonial rule, 1947. The most important outcome of this interaction between Britain and India was the growth of an English language. And today, many argue that English is as much an Indian language as other Indian languages are. We have a little map here, which, if you look at the colors, highlight the British provinces and the princely states. If you leave out the other countries which are in white, then we have almost the entire Indian subcontinent as under the British rule. You can pay a little attention to the provinces that are marked in a light pink color. There are some places which are highlighted in red dots, and these are places visited by Rudyard Kipling. Now, why Indian writings in English? Could we not have had some other name for a branch of literature that is written by Indian people but in the English language? The choices were simple, Anglo-Indian, but this had racial overtones. The other option was Indo-Anglian or Indo-Anglican, which we did use for Indian writings in English, but then it had slightly religious overtones. And so finally, perhaps the best way to talk about this literature is Indian writing in English. What then is Indian writings in English? It is, number one, as Indian as the literature in any other Indian language, and number two, it is a literature which is both Indian and English, and we will see why. One last aspect which we need to look into before we actually look at the literature is that what milieu or what background did this literature go in? And if it grew in this background, then what were the influencing factors? Generally, we talk about a literature as a product of race, milieu and moment. In the Indian context, race would mean nothing simple. It is the result of invasions, conquests and occupations extending 4,000 to 5,000 years. What does this mean? This means that whatever will be written in India will be the outcome of a very complex history, which includes not just India as such, but every foreign influence that made its way into our country over 1,000 years. Milieu. This involves the extremes of every kind related to geography and cultural history. This probably explains the kind of variety we have had, and the result of which is naturally a literature which has tremendous variety. What then is the moment? The moment is the exact meeting point between the West and the East. And perhaps if the British had not come here at all, we wouldn't have had the kind of literature in English we have today. There is a little note on this slide to which I would like to draw your attention, and that is that when we talk about the East-West encounter, it is not necessarily British, but includes influences from France, influences which are Portuguese, Dutch. In fact, every kind of merchant, missionary, administrator, adventurer who came to India in those years. A brief look into the history of this period would help. It would help us in what way? In this way that we would know something about how the English language became a part of Indian culture and why. Why did the British leave us a legacy of the English language which is now a part of our lives in a way that is quite different from the way English is used in other countries that were not colonial or that do not have a colonial history? The first important date is 1772. This is the year when the East India Company took over the administration of the British colony of India. 1781 is the date that Warren Hastings, the then Viceroy, established the Calcutta Madrasa. 1784 is the year that Sir William Jones established the Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal. Now, Sir William Jones is somewhat an important name. Sir William Jones was actually a jurist employed as a judge. He landed in Calcutta and it was soon discovered that he had a very special talent. He was a linguist and had a good knowledge of a number of languages like Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, English of course, Persian, Arabic, and so when he came to India, it was thought proper that his linguistic skills should be made use of to establish better relations with the Indian people. As a result, he was sent to Benares, brought in contact with people there. He acquired a very good knowledge of Sanskrit, and to William Jones we must give the credit for the first translations that took place of Sanskrit literature into English. It is he who made Kalidasa's Abhigyan Shakuntalam available to the Germans. That is how Goethe read this wonderful play and was so deeply impressed by it. Sir Thomas Munro in 1873 remarked, "If civilization were ever to become an article of trade between the two countries, that is India and England, England would greatly benefit from the import cargo." So it didn't take very long for some of the British intellectuals to realize that there was much in India to take as much to give. Another important date is 1780, when the Hickey's Bengal Gazette was started, and it was India's first English newspaper. We come to something significant now, and that is the establishment of private schools, which made possible or which made available an English education in places like Madras, Bombay and Calcutta. 1817 is the date for the establishment of the Hindu College by Raja Ram Mohan Roy at Calcutta. It is this institute that became the Presidency College in 1855, and this today is one of the premier institutions in India. What did all this result in? It resulted in the realization that there is need for a Western education in India, and so demands to establish institutions that could impart Western education were made, and in 1835 Lord William Bentinck resolved that the great object of the British government ought to be the promotion of European literature and science among the natives of India, and all funds appropriated for the purpose of education would be best employed on English education alone. This is why I have gone over a brief history of some important events related to the British rule in India. What I have simply tried to establish here is the coming of Western education and the fact that the English language came to India to stay. The results were introduction of a Western culture, the growth of a new awareness, a quickening of the intellectual and critical impulse, reawakening of the Indian spirit, and contact between modern science and the civilization of the West. To the Indian intellectual mind, this did wonders, and the beginnings of what we can call Indian writings in English lie in this quickening of a spirit that had long lain dormant. The beginnings of Indian English writings lie here. We can also call this spirit a literary renaissance. Renaissance as a word means rebirth. I would like you to pay a little close attention to what is said at the end of this slide. Many of those who wrote in their native languages were well versed in English and so translated their own works in English. And so we have a number of early writers who wrote not just in their own native languages, but in English as well. Either they did that or they translated their own works from the native language into English. Who are the early writers? The Renaissance in Indian literature then begins with number 1, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a very familiar name to all of us. We have read about him, known of him, talked about him very proudly for the social reforms that he brought into our society. He also established the Brahmo Samaj. To him we must give the credit for being able to integrate tradition with modernity. But we are more interested in Raja Ram Mohan Roy for what he did to Indian writings in English, and his greatest contribution was to English prose. Here we have a little picture of this great reformer. To this pre-Macaulay period also belong Henry Derozio, Kasiproshad Ghose, and Michael Madhusudan Dutt. Henry Derozio is also a well-known name. His poems are read even today. His works are marked by a romantic feeling coupled with a deep love for nature. The nature of his works is lyric poetry and also sonnets. He is also known for a novel called The Fakir of Jangira, which is a very graphic description of life, society in the pre-independence era. The second name on our list, Kasiproshad Ghose, is known for his poems. The Shire and Other Poems is the title of his collection, published 1830. He was also editor of the English weekly, The Hindu Intelligence. His works are somewhat imitative, his poetry is somewhat imitative, but it is also original in many ways. The fact that it tends to moralize, make use of conventional descriptions is very natural if we look at the time during which he was writing. Michael Madhusudan Dutt is an important name. His name can be explained by the fact that he was a Hindu convert to Christianity. His works show a variety. He wrote prose, poetry, drama, is the writer of a great epic, the Meghanad Badha. He also wrote a long narrative poem, Captive Lady. As is the case with most of these early writers, the impact of the English Romantics is there. And so naturally that love for nature, a sense of emotion, imagination, love for the simplicities of life can be seen in their works. The other names we can quickly look through are Keshav Chandra Sen, Dayanand Saraswati, the person who established the Arya Samaj in 1875, Ramakrishna Paramhans coupled with his pupil Vivekanand. And one other important event here is the publication of the Prabuddha Bharat, an English journal. We cannot pass through this period without mentioning two young girls, sisters, who together produced a volume of poetry that is remembered even today as beautiful, simple, musical, lyrical, and a major contribution to early English poetry. The title of their work is A Sheaf Gleaned in French Fields. This title can be explained by the fact that the two sisters lived in France for a while. They were deeply influenced by the Western culture, way of life. Their English education explains why they chose to write in English. But their works are beautiful, marked by the Indian spirit as well. A Sheaf Gleaned in French Fields is a collection of about 165 pieces of poetry, 8 of which were composed by Aru, which naturally tells us that it is Dutt who was the more prolific writer of the two. Ancient Ballads and Legends of Hindustan was published after Dutt's death, 1882, and she is also very famous for her shorter lyrics, and I thought it would be informative for you to know some of her important poems, at least their titles. Our Cats Were in a Tree, which is a very sweet poem about her childhood, and it includes memories of their youth in Calcutta, Bengal, and it recreates very effectively the atmosphere of the past. There is a sense of nostalgia, an emotion of loss that the poem creates. The Tree of Life, the Lotus. Dutt had a cousin. Their grandfathers were brothers. Romesh Chandra Dutt is the name of her cousin brother, who was also a poet and writer. His novels that are known well are The Lake of Palms, The Slave Girl of Agra. He also wrote histories, as in a history of civilization in ancient India and something called later Hindu civilization. During this period were also made translations of the Ramayana, Mahabharata, that is by Romesh Chandra Dutt, selections from the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, Buddhist literature, Kalidasa's long narrative poem Kumara Sambhav, and these were compiled as Lays of Ancient India, published 1894. His works are marked by the use of quatrains and couplets, clear condensed images and descriptions, scenes of sublime beauty. After this brief look into early poetry, we must stop at a very big name. He was known as Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. Why and how he became the versatile writer that he was is to do with the close association of his family with the time and people like Ram Mohan Roy and the turbulent period in Indian history during which he lived. It's interesting that he chose to write in both languages, Bengali and English, and his Bengali works were translated into English by him. He did it himself, and when he did it, it was not just a translation but a transcreation. He often chose to change the originals, and so we have very beautiful plays, poems. Here we have his picture, and here we have a list of everything that he was: a poet, a dramatist, an actor, a producer, a musician, painter, an educationist, philosopher, a novelist, and a short story writer. I don't think anything is left. He was influenced by the English Romantic poets, and by the time he was 50, he was the national poet of Bengal. His important works, we must touch on some titles: Our Gitanjali, The Crescent Moon, The Gardener, The Post Office, The Fugitive and Other Poems, Chitra, Sacrifice, The Home and the World, The Wreck, and a very famous novel called Gora. He was famous because of the way he wrote and spoke. He covered almost every aspect of Indian life in his prose writings. The Gitanjali is his most famous collection of poems, for which he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. The collection includes about 100 poems written in what we call the Bhakti tradition. That means they are not just poems, but they are like prayers, musical, filled with fine imagery, frequent use of conceits and metaphors. And Tagore's theme actually that runs through the entire book is a prayer for his country's freedom. Sri Aurobindo is a name that goes with Tagore. He is an equally outstanding figure. To him, we must give the credit for being the propounder of the notion of internal yoga. He was the writer of a famous collection, Life Divine, and one of the earliest interpretations of the Gita, the Vedas, the Upanishads comes from him. Here is his picture. His works run into categories, the first of which is his blank verse plays. These are 5 in number. They are called Perseus the Deliverer, Vasav Datta, Road June, The Viziers of Basora, and Eric. I think it is very evident from these titles that he wrote on legendary subjects. Most of his plays deal with myths or legends, not just from India, but also from Greece and Rome. Eric deals with a Scandinavian legend, in fact. His long narrative poems are Urvashi, again an Indian legend, Love and Death. However, his magnum opus, the finest and largest work, is Savitri. Savitri is a very long, complex epic poem that outwardly deals with the legend of Savitri and Satyavan, but actually uses it only as a symbol for talking about the more complex relationship between human evolution, divinity, the human soul and the divine soul, and it traces somewhat the entire evolution of life, the separation of the human soul from the divine center and the need, the yearning for the reunion. This whole process he called Sad-Chidanand. And so it is a more complex question of existence that Savitri deals with inwardly. Outwardly, however, it begins with the legend. Like book 1 begins with the day of Satyavan's death. On August 15th, 1914, Sri Aurobindo launched Arya. It was supposed to be a monthly philosophical journal related to the subject that interested him the most, which is life and philosophy. Together, his contributions are in the form of a group comprising of the life divine, essays on Gita, the synthesis of yoga, the secret of the Veda, the human cycle, the foundation of Indian culture, and many others. His works show wonderful use of blank verse, sensuous and beautiful imagery, creative verse translations from Bengali and Sanskrit, wide lyric range, use of imagination, suffusion of the philosophical and the mystical, and metaphysical speculations. Our interest in Aurobindo Ghosh would lie not only for the fact that he is one of our greatest philosophers, but also what he did for the Indian English writings as such. Sarojini Naidu is the next name we have to stop at. She is a famous poetess whose poems are read even today for their beauty, simplicity, and reflection of Indian life. She was as young as 13 when she wrote her first long English narrative poem running into 2000 lines. She was a Bengali Chattopadhyay known as Sarojini Chattopadhyay, and she fell in love with an Andhrite, a Naidu. The family naturally objected to the alliance, and her father sent her to England, hoping that she would forget about him. But what happened in England was that her love for writing, that also English poetry, received an impetus because of her contact with some great English poets like Edmund Gosse and Arthur Symonds. It is from them that she received encouragement, confidence, and even advice. For example, what Edmund Gosse did was that he helped her to realize that it may not be a very good idea to write on English subjects, and why not she use her talent to write in English, but about Indian customs, Indian themes, and Indian traditions. And that is what she did. Other than that, she acquired technical and verbal perfection, mastery of phrase and rhythm. Actually, she was a good poet, but then she did not have those skills. So, the honing of the skills, the acquiring of the technical perfection, that is what she got from her contact with these great men. Here we have her picture, and this picture shows her contact with the freedom struggle. We can see her with Mahatma Gandhi. And so her involvement in Indian politics came along with her writings. Her important works are The Golden Threshold, which was her first collection of poems, published 1905. As we all know, she was also hailed as the Nightingale of India because of the sweetness of her verse. In 1906, she addressed the Calcutta session of the Indian Social Conference on Women's Rights. She entered into the freedom struggle, as I just said, and in 1912 she published her second collection of poems entitled The Bird of Time. Her final collection, titled The Broken Wing, was published in 1917. Her poems deal with themes related to children, nature, patriotism, love and death. As we move through this little study on her life and works, I must mention some of her very famous poems. Palanquin Bearers is a very beautiful poem describing the song that the palanquin bearers sing as they carry the bride from her father's home to her husband's home. Wandering Singers and Indian Weavers is a symbolic kind of poem reflecting on the 4 stages of life. Her poetry is marked by perfect rhyme and rhythm, powerful use of images, love for nature, and then she will refer to Indian flowers like the lotus or champak, use of history and legend as in the poem Humayun to Zubaydah. With this study on history of Indian English poetry, we move to drama. The beginnings of Indian English drama lie with Madhusudan Dutt's Is This Called Civilization?, Tagore's Chitra, The Post Office, Red Oleanders, and Aurobindo's 5 plays, which I have already mentioned before. These plays deal with legendary stories, are well constructed with well drawn characters and powerful blank verse if they are written in poetry. The early plays are followed by Harindranath Chattopadhyay's 5 plays, published 1937, reflecting social consciousness, flair for realism, powerful prose and leftist leanings. Now these 4 points on the slide show that sooner or later Indian English writing had to get involved with the politics of the time. And so we have a number of works belonging to this period that deal with issues. Now what kind of issues? Mainly political and social issues, because these were turbulent times for India. And how could an intellectual and a writer not be involved with the major developments taking place on the political scene as well as the social upheavals? T.P. Kailasam is another early dramatist. His important plays are The Burden, The Fulfilment, Karna. These plays reflect legendary themes once again, but then these legends are not there for their own sake. They are made to connect with the life and times during which the dramatist is writing. Some of his plays deal with characters from Indian legend like Karna, Draupadi, Krishna, Eklavya, Kunti and Bharat. His works are marked by superb self-expression, which means that he is not merely imitating. There is a need to reflect his own writing skill as well as the tradition of India in his works. G.V. Desani is another early dramatist whose most important play is Hali, published 1950. It is a symbolic poetic play. Asif Karim Bhoy is the third important name we must stop at. His important plays are The Tourists, Mecca, The Clock, The Doll Drummers, The Dumb Dancer. His works are marked by powerful dialogue, deep sense of setting, atmosphere, and use of Vedic and Upanishad lore, as in plays like Om, which is a philosophic play dealing with the theme of birth, death and rebirth. Lakhan Dev's The Tiger Claw, 1967, deals with the theme of the controversial murder of Afzal Khan by Shivaji. Pratap Sharma's A Touch of Brightness, Nissim Ezekiel's Nalini, and The Sleepwalkers, Guru Charan Das's Laran Sahib reflect the following themes and features: realism, use of comedy, tragicomedy, farce and history. What then is the result of the effort of all these writers? The result is that Indian English drama evolved as a genre of its own. Today, it has seen great progress through the works of two important dramatists, Girish Karnad and Mahesh Dattani. I would like to mention something here. As such, drama in Indian English writings could not have evolved very easily. The reason is that drama is a genre that inevitably requires a close communion between the audience and the play. Dramas are meant to be staged and they will not connect with an audience unless there is something in them to attract the viewers. Therefore, drama in India has been more successful in the regional languages. And so, in Indian English writings, drama has progressed slowly, but today it has a force to reckon with. Girish Karnad's important plays are Tughlaq, Yayati and Heyvadan. I don't know if the titles tell you something, but they do suggest that his plays are historical in the sense that they make use of history and myth, but once again not for their own sake. If Karnad writes a play like Tughlaq, he is using the character and times of Tughlaq to comment on the India of today. Heyvadan is once again very mythical, as is Yayati. M. V. Rama Sharma, collected plays published 1982. Deena Mehta, The Myth Makers, published 1967. Arati Nagarwala, Ahmad Akhtar, K. S. Dugal, M. V. Iyengar and Manohar Malgaonkar are some other names that we must know, because their contributions to making Indian English drama popular is tremendous and needs to be acknowledged. Here we have a little picture of Mahesh Dattani and Karna. This little picture on the side gives you an idea of the kind of plays that are being performed today. These come under the category of Nukkar Natak. They are street plays as such. Their purpose is to enlighten the public, to make them aware of the times, of the problems and difficulties, maybe even suggest solutions to redress, correct what is happening. Of these two, Karna, as I just mentioned, deals more with myth and legend, but Dattani is the braver in the sense that is the braver of the two, in the sense that he is using his plays to touch on very controversial themes and issues like women's issues, the problem of child abuse, homosexuality, and many of the current problems in India today. Of Karna, it has been said, I quote, "He has a historic vision, but a contemporary voice which makes his plays very universal." This is exactly what I tried to explain, the combination between contemporariness and history. There is a quote here. He says, "I am happy to belong to a generation that had a Dharamveer Bharti, a Mohan Rakesh, a Vijay Tendulkar and I. Together, we can claim that we did create a national theatre for modern India." It may not sound modest, but it is. And he includes in his group writers like Vijay Tendulkar and Mohan Rakesh, who are also trying to make a difference through their plays. Mahesh Dattani has been described as India's best and most serious contemporary playwright. He was awarded the Sahitya Academy Award. He has been a playwright and director. He teaches theatre courses at the summer session programs of the Portland University, USA. He's been a director, actor, dancer, teacher, writer. He also gives training to students who wish to become theatre artists. He runs his own theatre studio in Bangalore. His important plays are Bravely Fought the Queen, Dance Like a Man, Do the Needful, Final Solutions, Night Queen, 30 Days in September, which is very well known, and Where There's a Will.